When you think of God, what comes to mind, and how do you know if you're right? Let's talk about it on this week's episode of Journey at Home. Hey everybody, let me ask you the question that we're going to consider for the next 3 weeks. It's simply this: what is God really like? Now maybe you've had somebody ask you that before, maybe you've asked it yourself, and your answer to this question matters because how we think about God matters. How you think about God, it shapes every area of your life. How you think about God determines your approach to life, and if you think about it, it defines what you value in life. The truth is, it is really tough to get life right if you get God wrong. In other words, if you believe in God and you're wrong, well, you're going to get life wrong, aren't you? And if you don't believe in God and you're wrong, well, you're going to get life wrong. If you believe in a picture of God that's wrong, you're going to get life wrong. And the truth is, everybody has an opinion about God, and everybody thinks their view of God is the right one. Have you noticed that? I mean, there's no shortage of opinions on God, which makes answering this question really difficult. Who gets to decide who's right? So instead of all of us debating our personal views of God, what I want to help us do over the next 3 episodes is I want to help us take our views of God, whatever they may be, and actually compare them to the only standard of God that we can count on and depend on is accurate. And that's what Jesus said about God. See, Jesus showed up on earth to communicate and to demonstrate to us exactly what God is like. His goal was to clear up the confusion. Matter of fact, when his follower Philip, when he asked Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, show us what God's like," Jesus' answer was very direct, and quite honestly, it was really shocking. Jesus looked back at Philip and said, "If you've seen me, Philip, you've seen the Father." Sounds pretty arrogant, doesn't it? And it must have seemed way more than arrogant to Philip. It had to have sounded crazy because less than 24 hours after making that statement, Jesus' body hung lifeless on a Roman cross. So why would anybody believe he knows anything about what God is like? Well, they wouldn't, and we wouldn't, except for the fact that 3 days later, Jesus walked out of his own tomb under his own power. And as I've told you before, when you hear a man predict his own death and resurrection and then pull it off, you ought to trust everything he said. So that's the reason I think we should all lean into how Jesus describes what God is like. And so to help us answer this question, we're going to spend these next 3 episodes looking at one of Jesus' most famous stories. And as we do that, I want to encourage you to do 2 things. First, I want you to decide for yourself if you trust what Jesus says about God. And if you don't trust him, you owe it to yourself to examine why you don't. And then second, I want you to compare whatever view you have of God to what Jesus says God is really like. So let me give you the context that prompted Jesus to tell this story. It's found in Luke 15. And Luke tells us, now the tax collectors and the sinners, they were all gathering around to hear Jesus. And it's important to understand why that's so significant. You got to know a little bit about first century culture. See, in Israel at that time, they categorized people in one of 4 ways. You could think of it as they put everybody in one of 4 buckets, okay? And the belief was that some of these people, some of these groups were closer to God than others, and God cared about some of these groups more than he did others. So the top group, if you will, the people they thought were closest to God were the religious leaders. And then the category under that was practicing Jews. These were people who were trying to follow the law of Moses. They were religious, if you will. They went to the temple, they offered their sacrifices, said their prayers, all those things. Then the third category of people were the sinners. These were people who had given up on following the law of Moses. They weren't even really trying anymore. And their lifestyle was so different from a quote-unquote good Jew that they weren't respected at all. But they weren't considered the worst group. The bottom group, well, that was reserved for the tax collectors. Now, these were Jewish people who had partnered with the occupying Romans, and they were actually stealing from their fellow Jews. So obviously, they were considered traitors. They were hated by pretty much everybody. And the thing is, every one of these groups, they all had their own view of what God was like and how God felt about them. Which, if you think about it, this really isn't a lot different from our way of thinking, isn't it? We could just change the names, For us, the top group, a lot of us think, well, that's the pastors and the priests. They're closest to God. And they're the ones that God, pays the most attention to. Then underneath them are the church people, Those are the good religious people trying to follow God, trying to do what God tells them to do. They're trying to do the right thing. And the thing is that, those church people, they may not always get it right, but they're trying to get it right. And while they don't have God's attention quite like pastors and priests, he's obviously still good with them. And then underneath them, well, those are the sinners today, which would be people not in church, right? And they may be moral people, but clearly they're not as close to God as people who go to church. And so the assumption is God certainly doesn't care about them as much as all those other church people. And then at the bottom of the ladder are Austin Peay fans, right? No, that's, we just think that. No, at the bottom of the ladder are the people that we might consider nearly irredeemable. And that group is different for everybody. Maybe for you, you would say, oh, those are the child abusers. Those are the spouse abusers. Those are the rapists. Those are the murderers. Those are the terrorists. Maybe it's more personal. Maybe for you, it's an alcoholic father who abandoned you, a spouse who left you for someone else. But you probably got somebody, you've got a group of somebodies. If you were honest, you would say, okay, I think they're pretty much irredeemable. So I want you to think about the people that you know in these two bottom categories, okay? Because Luke tells us that it was these kinds of people, not the church people, who had gathered around to hear Jesus. Meanwhile, he tells us, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, so the religious leaders, at the top, they see this going on and they mutter, well, this man welcomes sinners and he eats with them. I mean, they just couldn't get it because from their point of view, God would be for good people like them and he would be against people who were not like them. I mean, that's the kind of God he was. So Jesus pauses and he tells us three stories that all had the same purpose. And the purpose was he wanted to explain to these religious leaders exactly what God was like, why God would spend so much time around people nothing like him. And I'm going to let you read the first two stories for yourself if you want. It's the third one that we're going to focus on during this series. And anytime Jesus told one of these made-up stories with a point, the thing you have to understand is somebody represented God and somebody represented us. So I'll let you try to figure out who God is in the story, right? Here's how it goes. Luke says, Jesus said, there was a man who had two sons. Luke records this for us. And Jesus says in the story, the younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. Now, we're going to talk more about the son in the next episode, but this was the son's way of saying, Dad, I just wish you were dead. I don't really care about you. I value your stuff way more than I value my relationship with you. So how about we just go ahead and pretend that you're dead? You give me what I'm going to get when you die, and then I'm out of here. And as Jesus tells his story, to the shock of everyone, he says the father doesn't try to control the son. He just goes ahead and gives the son whatever he wants. He divides his property between them, between the younger son and the older son, right? And according to Jewish inheritance customs, the older son would get 2/3 ownership of all the assets. The younger son was going to get 1/3. And so he divides it all up. And then the younger son does exactly what you would predict he would do. Jesus says, well, not long after he gets all his stuff, the younger son got together all that he had. He set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. But, as so often happens to all of us in life, Jesus says after he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country. It's really unfortunate timing for him. And he began to be in need. And so, Jesus says he did what he hoped he'd never have to do. He got a job. He went and he hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. And it was so bad that Jesus says this young son longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but nobody gave him anything. Now, I don't know how you define rock bottom, but listen, it can't get much worse than being so hungry you're craving pig slop, right? And then to add insult to injury, this guy had nobody in his life who cared about him enough to give him anything. I mean, all those friends who had showed up when he had money, they're long gone now, right? He's broke. He can't do anything for him. But this is where the story turns. It says when he came to his senses, he said to himself, well, how many of my father's hired servants back home? They've got food to spare. Here I am starving to death. Tell you what I'll do. I'll set out. I'll go back to my father, and I'm going to say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven, and I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, so could you make me like one of your hired servants? And then Jesus tells us he got up, he went to his father. And this is where it gets fascinating. But while he was still a long way off, Jesus says his father saw him. He saw him coming. His father was filled with compassion for him. So he ran to his son, he threw his arms around him, and he kissed him. And the son, he starts in on the speech. He says, Father, I've sinned against heaven, against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But Jesus says the father interrupts him. He looks at his servants and says, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Let's put a ring on his finger. Let's put sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. In other words, let's have a feast and celebrate, because this son of mine was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and he's found. And Jesus ends the story, this part of the story, by saying, so they began to celebrate. Now, we're going to circle back to the story next episode, because there's a really profound insight in how the father treated his younger son that I think will help us all understand what God is like. But right now, I don't want you to miss the obvious point. Who was it in Jesus' story that represents God? What did Jesus just say God is like? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? God is a father. This is how he invites you to relate to him. This is what he invites you to call him, your heavenly Father. I mean, why would Jesus do that? Not because God is a man. I mean, he's not a man. God's a spirit. But Jesus uses the example of a father because in the first century, this is what those people would best understand. Now, for some of you, I realize this may make it more complicated for you to understand and to get your arms around what God is like, because you're not like me. You didn't grow up with a great father who was an example of how God views you. But Jesus, he uses this metaphor of a father because he wants you and me to know that your God, he is personal. He's not distant. He's not detached. He's personal. He wants you to know God is perfect. He is what a perfect father would be like. So I thought I'd give you a list of a few of the qualities that we learn about God from this fictional father in Jesus' story. Think about it. We learn from Jesus that God is sufficient. He's got everything that we'll ever need. He's sacrificial. I mean, he's willing to pay a price to honor the freedom of his children. He's patient. He's hopeful. The father in the story, he waited and he watched for his son to return, just hoping for the relationship to be restored. But he didn't try to rescue the son from the consequences of his decisions. He just let him pursue the life he wanted, but he never lost hope that he'd eventually come back. We learn that God's a father who's caring, who's compassionate. I mean, the moment the son returned, the father just showered him with compassion, not with judgment, not with mercy, or not with punishment, but with mercy. He was generous. He was joyful. I mean, his response to the son's return was to give and to celebrate, not to make the son earn back his place. So what do you think about when you think about God? Now listen, if words like that come to mind, maybe your view of God isn't entirely accurate. If you have a hard time viewing God as your perfect father, then I think the question is, what could you be missing? Why is it so hard to think of him that way? See, your heavenly Father loves you unconditionally, like any perfect father would, which means there are no ladders, there are no tiers to who he loves more. He loves the irredeemable just as much as he loves the pastor. He loves you no more or no less, regardless of what you do. Now, next episode, we're going to dig more into this story and how God as Father relates to each of us. But for now, I just want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about how you view God. Do you view him as a personal, perfect Father? What words would you use to describe him? What comes to mind when you think about God? Because listen, whatever comes to mind when you think about God determines how you relate to God and whether you can think of yourself the way God thinks of you. So this is important to consider. It's important to get right. And if you find yourself resisting how Jesus described God, well, you owe it to yourself to figure out why this week. Maybe you make your own list of words that describe who you think God is, and then compare them to the words that describe the Father in Jesus' story. And then you got to figure out which list you're going to believe, because it's hard to get life right when you've got God wrong. And Jesus came so you wouldn't.